What was it exactly that the world believed it heard in the silence of an ancient stone calendar? Somewhere between carved glyphs, collapsed cities, and the nervous pulse of the modern age, a date was lifted out of its own forgotten sky and made to carry the weight of a global fear. It arrived like mist over water, half scholarship, half hunger, half something more difficult to name. And before the night carries everything further inward, before the body grows heavy and the room begins to soften at its edges, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this quiet work truly speaks to you. And if they wish, listeners may leave their location and local time below, like a small signal sent out from one sleeping corner of the world to another. Long before the year 2012 was printed on survival manuals, whispered through documentaries, or folded into the circuitry of online panic, the Maya had already become a people partly buried beneath the imagination of others. Their temples stood in the forests of Mesoamerica like thoughts too large to disappear, though many tried to make them disappear anyway. Rain wore at the limestone, roots slipped into the cracks, priests and conquerors burned books, empires renamed what they did not understand. Later centuries would excavate stones from beneath vines and speak of rediscovery, as if a civilization only began to exist once an outsider had learned how to point at it. And yet, the most unsettling thing was never that the Maya left behind ruins. Many civilizations did. The more troubling fact was that they left behind a system for measuring time so intricate, so mathematically elegant, and so bound to celestial rhythm that it almost seemed designed to provoke misunderstanding in minds trained to think of time as a single line racing toward an end. The Maya did not leave one clock. They left interlocking worlds of time, ritual time, solar time, dynastic time, mythic time. Time that returned, time that accumulated, time that echoed. But when fragments of that system began to filter into the modern imagination, a different desire took hold. A civilization known mostly through broken surfaces was asked to confirm one of the oldest obsessions of all, that the end was near, that history was a corridor, that someone far older had foreseen the cracking of the final wall. It is difficult to say when fear truly began, because fear rarely begins where it claims to begin. It gathers, it borrows language, it wears the clothing of interpretation. By the late 20th century, a particular date associated with the Maya long count calendar had slipped free from its original context and begun to circulate in books, television specials, spiritual movements, and speculative theories. December 21st, 2012 became a stage upon which modern anxieties could perform themselves. Climate dread stood beside financial instability. Digital acceleration stood beside spiritual exhaustion. Solar storms, magnetic reversals, hidden planets, prophetic alignments, collapse scenarios, and cosmic resets all drifted toward that date as if it were a drain in the centre of the human imagination. But a date is not a prophecy merely because people tremble before it. The deeper mystery, and perhaps the more human one, lies in how easily a damaged archive becomes a mirror. When texts are lost, when symbols are half deciphered, when the keepers of knowledge are silenced or forced into other languages, later generations do not simply inherit absence, they begin to fill it. Into every historical gap slips a wish, a fear, a system, a market, a theology. This is how an ancient civilization can become both revered and distorted at the same time. The Maya were praised as master astronomers, keepers of cycles, readers of the sky. Yet the same admiration often flattened them into a single role, mysterious prophets from a vanished world, waiting to validate modern apocalyptic desire. That description was convenient in more ways than one. It turned living descendants into ghosts. It treated one of the most intellectually sophisticated civilizations of the ancient Americas as an atmosphere rather than a people. It encouraged the fantasy that knowledge becomes more powerful once its original voice has been muted, and perhaps that fantasy is not new. Across history, knowledge torn from its makers is often made easier to worship and easier to misuse. The Maya themselves did not vanish, though the old story liked to pretend they had. Their cities changed. Some great urban centres declined. Political systems fractured. Drought may have tightened its grip across regions already strained by warfare, deforestation, and shifting power. But collapse is not the same as extinction, and silence in the record is not the same as silence in the world. Millions of Maya descendants still live across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Their languages survive, their memory survives. Their existence quietly exposes one of the strangest habits of modern historical imagination: the urge to turn interrupted civilizations into legends so that the living no longer complicate the myth. Perhaps that is where this story truly begins, not with a countdown, but with a misreading. Because the year 2012 did not emerge from the Maya world as a howl of annihilation. It emerged from a modern world deeply prepared to hear one. A civilization accustomed to deadlines, crises, and endings found itself fascinated by another culture's way of numbering vast stretches of time. But fascination without patience tends to become projection. A turning point in a calendrical cycle was translated into final judgment. Completion was mistaken for destruction. Renewal was retold as doom. And all the while the old stones remained where they had always been, absorbing heat by day, releasing it at night, saying only what they had been carved to say, and nothing more. Still, the misunderstanding did not grow out of pure ignorance. It fed on genuine fragments. There were inscriptions, there were calendar notations, there were scholars piecing together a system partly shattered by conquest. There were mysterious monuments, damaged codices, scattered glyphs, and the slow, difficult labour of epigraphy. There was enough truth to give the illusion of certainty. That may be what makes historical distortion so enduring. The lie is rarely built from nothing. It is built from one real stone placed in the wrong wall. And beneath all of this lingers another question, quieter and more unsettling than whether the world was ever supposed to end in 2012. Why was the modern world so ready, even eager, to believe that it might? Why did an ancient calendar become credible only when it seemed to promise catastrophe? Why do broken civilizations so often become containers for present-day dread? Perhaps every age hears in the ruins of the past whatever it cannot bear to confess about itself. In the forests where Maya cities once rose in white stone and painted red stucco, the air is thick with insects, moisture, leaf rot, and memory. Structures appear slowly there, never all at once. A stairway emerges from shadow. A carved face comes forward through lichen. A date survives on a monument after the palace around it has fallen. History, in such places, does not return like a revelation. It returns like breath on glass. One shape at a time, one correction at a time, one lost meaning pressing faintly against the surface. And so the first threshold in this long passage is not the end of the world, but the beginning of a suspicion. That the real story was buried beneath the panic. That somewhere between conquest, scholarship, commerce, and longing, the Maya were made to announce something they may never have said. If that is true, then the question waiting in the dark is not whether the world should have ended in 2012. It is whose voice was heard when everyone claimed the Maya were speaking. The strange authority of a ruin often begins with distance. A city still inhabited must answer questions in the present tense. A broken city does not. It can be stared at, interpreted, arranged into neat theories, and made to serve the emotional needs of later centuries. Perhaps that is why the Maya world, once so crowded with voices, became in modern imagination a landscape of abandoned stone and prophetic silence. It was easier, perhaps, to imagine wisdom preserved in collapse than wisdom continuing in living communities beyond the frame of the ruin. The old cities did not vanish in one gesture. They dimmed unevenly across centuries and across regions. each place carrying its own burden of drought, political rivalry, resource strain, ritual expectation, and environmental pressure. Tikal, Copan, Palenque, Calakmul, Caracol, names that now sound almost ceremonial in the mouths of visitors, were once crowded centres of governance, ceremony, astronomy, tribute, warfare, craft production, and dynastic performance. Their plazas were not designed for silence. They were made for footsteps, for smoke, for painted cloth moving in wind, for the recitation of lineage and the embodied theatre of kingship. Children ran through those spaces. Scribes bent over bark paper codices. Priests watched the sky from stair-stepped platforms. Rulers commissioned monuments not only to glorify themselves, but to bind earthly power to cosmic order. Then something shifted, or rather, many things did. Archaeology, cautious by nature and honest at its best, has never offered a single theatrical explanation for what happened in the so-called classic Maya collapse. Instead, it has described a convergence, prolonged droughts suggested by lake sediments and cave records, agricultural stress in landscapes pushed hard by growing populations, political fragmentation and endemic warfare attested in inscriptions and fortifications, dynastic instability, disrupted trade routes, perhaps the exhaustion of systems that had once seemed capable of reproducing sacred order indefinitely. This does not make the story less dramatic, it only makes it more human. Civilizations rarely fall because one door slams shut. More often the air changes, the rains hesitate, the grain thins, alliances crack, belief strains under material pressure, and what once looked eternal begins to depend on too many fragile things at once. Yet the image that survived in popular culture was simpler. The jungle swallowed the cities. The people disappeared. The calendar kept counting. It is a powerful image, almost hypnotic in its elegance. But simplicity can be another form of erasure. The Maya did not cease to exist when certain urban centres declined. Communities reorganised. Political centres shifted northward in some regions. Cultural traditions adapted. Languages endured. Ritual life persisted in altered forms. The descendants of those who built the great cities did not melt into the forest like a fable. They remained in history, though history often preferred them most when it imagined them absent. That preference has consequences. When a civilization is treated as vanished, it becomes easier to detach its achievements from its descendants. Astronomical knowledge becomes an artifact, not a heritage. Architecture becomes an enigma, not a tradition born from labour, worldview, and social structure. The calendar becomes a coded relic waiting for modern interpretation, rather than one part of a living intellectual framework whose original context was partly shattered by colonial violence. Silence, in that sense, is not always natural. Sometimes it is produced. The forests of the Yucatan, Guatemala, Belize, and Chiapas did not merely conceal ruins, they concealed the violence of interruption. Spanish clerics and colonial administrators did not encounter a dead civilization. They encountered active communities, surviving texts, ritual systems, calendrical practices, and local forms of memory that did not fit neatly into Christian imperial order. Some sought to document what they found, often imperfectly. Others sought to stamp it out. Few scenes in the history of cultural destruction carry the same ache as the burning of Maya books under Bishop Diego de Landa in the 16th century. He later recorded fragments of what he'd seen, but the irony is almost too sharp to hold comfortably. A witness to destruction, becoming at the same time one of the surviving channels through which later generations tried to recover what had been destroyed. Only a handful of pre-Columbian Maya codices survive today. 4 are generally recognized as authentic: the Dresden, Madrid, Paris, and the once disputed Grolier, now more often called the Maya Codex of Mexico. It is difficult to overstate what this means. A civilization with a rich writing system, astronomical sophistication, ritual chronology, and centuries of intellectual life reaches the modern age through a tiny remnant of its own books. And from that remnant, later readers attempted to reconstruct entire universes of meaning. What could possibly go wrong in such a situation except almost everything? The archive was not merely incomplete, it was wounded. Into that wound entered speculation. There is, of course, nothing inherently foolish in feeling awe before a Maya site. Awe may be one of the most appropriate responses. A pyramid rises above the trees. A staircase angles toward a sky that once served as both clock and scripture. A stela bears glyphs that look, to untrained eyes, like a form of thought halfway between language and constellation. Even before decipherment advanced, travellers sensed that these monuments belonged to a civilization of profound complexity. But all without context is unstable. It can curdle into exoticism. It can transform people into symbols and chronology into omen. The ruins then become less a record of Maya life than a theatre for modern projections. This is one of the hidden currents beneath the 2012 panic. The fear did not emerge only from a date. It emerged from the mood created by ruins themselves. A broken city suggests warning. A half-lost script suggests encoded truth. A culture interrupted by conquest seems, to later imagination, to have left behind unfinished messages. The modern world, especially in times of unease, is drawn irresistibly to unfinished messages. It wants them to speak directly to contemporary dread. It wants the dead to have foreseen what the living still cannot explain. And yet the stones say less than people hope, and more than people notice. A collapsed lintel says that even monumental order is mortal. A buried plaza says that memory can survive without visibility. A carved date, still legible after kingdoms have dissolved, says that human beings once believed time could be fixed into stone and carried forward beyond the lives of those who commissioned it. Perhaps this is why the Maya world exerts such power over the modern mind. It brings together two opposite sensations at once: precision and loss, knowledge and interruption, grandeur and erosion. It does not offer comfort, it offers scale. Somewhere in that scale, the myth of 2012 found fertile ground. Not because the ruins themselves predicted doom, but because they seemed to belong to a civilization that had already crossed some threshold of knowing that modernity feared it had missed. This is how abandoned architecture becomes prophecy in the imagination of those who encounter it too late. They do not only ask what happened here, they ask what these people knew before they were broken. But that question leads further inward, and more carefully toward the true architecture of Maya time. The cities may be wounded, the books may be burned, and the voices may reach the present only in fragments, yet one thing continues to emerge from the wreckage with astonishing clarity. This civilization did not merely build in stone, it built in cycles, and once that door begins to open, the idea of an ending starts to look less certain than the world once wanted it to be. There are civilizations that leave behind weapons, walls, and the names of kings. The Maya left those as well, but beneath all of it there was something less visible and perhaps more enduring. A way of arranging existence through time so intricate that it still resists hurried understanding. The modern habit of asking whether the world was supposed to end in 2012 depends on a familiar assumption, almost invisible because it feels so natural. It assumes that time is a road. One beginning, one middle, one final edge, one last door. But for the Maya, time did not always behave like a road. It moved more like a field of repeating patterns, a turning architecture in which endings were rarely empty and beginnings were rarely pure. To enter that architecture, even slowly, is to feel the modern imagination begin to lose its balance. The Maya did not rely on a single calendar. They lived inside several systems at once, each measuring a different face of reality. There was the Tzolk'in, the sacred count of 260 days, a cycle deeply bound to ritual, divination, naming, and ceremonial timing. There was the Harb, a solar calendar of 365 days, closer to the agricultural and seasonal rhythms that shaped everyday life. These two cycles moved together like gears, meeting in combinations that repeated every 52 Hab years in what scholars often call the calendar round. This alone is enough to disturb the simplifications of modern thinking. The Maya did not merely count days. They created relationships between cycles, allowing time to be read through recurrence, intersection, and resonance. A day in such a world was not empty. It carried character. Each name in the Solkin cycle came paired with a number and with ritual significance. Time was qualitative as well as numerical. It was counted, but it was also felt, interpreted, inhabited. This does not mean the Maya were vague mystics wandering beneath the stars. Quite the opposite. Their systems reveal a mind of remarkable precision. What makes that precision so difficult for the modern world to hold is that it was never separated cleanly from cosmology, ceremony, politics, and sacred obligation. Astronomy was not isolated from myth. Mathematics was not severed from ritual. The motion of heavenly bodies was not simply observed for curiosity. It helped organize the moral and ceremonial grammar of life. Perhaps this is where misunderstanding first begins. Modern societies are comfortable admiring ancient knowledge so long as it can be translated into familiar categories. Mathematics may be praised, astronomical observations may be praised, engineering may be praised. But once these are joined to ritual consciousness and cyclical metaphysics, the system becomes harder to domesticate. It starts to feel foreign in a deeper sense, and what cannot be comfortably translated is often simplified instead. Yet the Maya did not build a lesser science because it was inseparable from sacred meaning. They built a different one. The calculation of celestial rhythms could be astonishingly refined. The Dresden Codex, one of the precious few surviving pre-Columbian Maya books, preserves astronomical tables that track the movements of Venus with extraordinary care. Venus was not merely a bright object in the dawn sky. It was a force within the symbolic order of the world, linked to warfare, timing, omen, and power. To watch Venus was to do more than watch a planet. It was to read a pulse in the larger body of the cosmos. Eclipse tables, seasonal observances, and monumental alignments all suggest that the Maya treated the heavens as a patterned text, one that required disciplined attention over generations. This is important because when later audiences heard that the Maya calendar ended in 2012, they imagined something like the final page of a book or the detonation of a clock. But within Maya thought, cycles concluded constantly. Completion did not automatically imply obliteration. One pattern closed so that another could begin. The logic was not always one of termination. It was often one of renewal, repositioning, or return. A cycle ending could be solemn, powerful, even dangerous, but danger is not the same thing as universal annihilation. There is something almost tender in this, and something unnerving. Tender because it suggests a world in which time breathes rather than merely expires. Unnerving because it challenges one of modernity's deepest emotional habits, the fixation on final crisis. A culture trained by deadlines, collapses, and apocalyptic narratives wants a climax. It wants history to gather itself into one final spectacle, but cyclical time disperses that drama. It refuses to grant unique privilege to the final moment. What ends has ended before in another form. What returns is never entirely new. The Maya were hardly alone in imagining time through repetition. Many ancient cultures held cyclical models of history, season, ritual, and cosmic order. Yet the Maya rendered that sensibility with unusual mathematical sophistication. Their numbering system, based on vigesimal principles and including the use of zero, allowed them to handle enormous spans of time with elegant clarity. This was no small intellectual achievement. Zero itself remains one of the most profound conceptual tools ever developed in human history, and the Maya employed it independently in calendrical notation centuries before it was widely adopted in Europe. A civilization capable of this kind of abstraction was not scribbling random omens into stone, and waiting for future television producers to decode them. It was thinking on scales that modern popular culture often claims to admire while consistently refusing to understand. Still, the emotional power of an end date remained irresistible. Why? Because a cycle large enough to feel remote can easily be mistaken for absolute. When a long span concludes, people unfamiliar with its logic assume nothing lies beyond it. A calendar on a kitchen wall reaches December and stops. The paper ends. The year ends. The habit of reading calendars as disposable and linear may sound trivial, but perhaps it prepared the imagination to misread the Maya more than any academic detail did. A counting system built to roll forward through immense intervals was interpreted by a later world trained to see the edge of the page as a form of destiny. And there is another layer, more subtle still. To a society burdened by ecological anxiety, technological acceleration, and a diffuse feeling that something in the human order has gone dangerously out of rhythm, the Maya offered not merely an ancient calendar, but a lost authority. They seemed to stand closer to the cosmos, closer to primordial patterns, closer to a kind of knowledge modernity feared it had traded away. In that mood, the end of a major cycle began to feel less like a routine transition and more like a judgment. Not because the Maya said so, but because the modern world had already begun to suspect that its own way of measuring time had become spiritually empty. Thus the misunderstanding deepened. The Maya were seen as astronomers of doom rather than custodians of recurrence. Their cycles were treated as countdowns. Their mathematics was made to serve modern panic. And all the while, beneath the distortion, the actual shape of their timekeeping remained more beautiful and more difficult than the myth allowed. A braided system of ritual, season, number, and celestial observation, where endings had meaning, but not always the meaning outsiders craved. The closer one moves toward the long count itself, the clearer this tension becomes. For there, in the very mechanism that would later be dragged into the mythology of 2012, lies the most revealing paradox of all. The cycle that modern fear interpreted as a final warning may have been, in its own intellectual home, something far stranger and far more measured. A way not of predicting the death of the world, but of situating human life within expanses of time so large that fear itself begins to look provincial. The closer the modern imagination moved toward the long count, the more it began to mistake scale for finality. Perhaps that confusion was inevitable. There is something unsettling about a system built to number vastness. It makes ordinary calendars feel domestic, almost fragile. A wall calendar lives close to the body. It marks appointments, birthdays, deadlines, errands, small anniversaries of private life. The long count does something else. It stretches perception outward. It asks the mind to stand beneath durations so immense that individual lives begin to resemble sparks carried briefly across a dark field. And when people unused to that scale encounter a major turning point within it, they often respond in the most familiar way they know. They call it an ending. The long count was designed to track days across far greater spans than the cyclical rounds of ritual and solar calendars could easily distinguish. Inscriptions recorded dates using a sequence of units: kin for a day, winal for 20 days, tun for 360 days, katun for 7,200 days, and baktun for 144,000 days. This structure allowed Maya scribes to place events precisely within deep chronological frameworks. Dynastic accessions, rituals, dedications, mythic echoes, and political acts could all be situated not only in the immediate present, but against a much larger architecture of time. It was a way of giving events weight. A king did not merely stand on a platform. He stood at a named position in the turning order of days. There is something almost ceremonial in that precision. To date an event in the long count was not simply to register when it happened, it was to place it inside a cosmic grammar. Number became orientation, time became location. One can begin to understand why monuments bearing such dates still feel charged with more than chronology. They do not seem to say merely this happened here. They seem to say this happened at a hinge in the living order of the world, and that perhaps is where later distortion found its opening. The date associated with the much publicised 2012 moment corresponds to the completion of 13 back-toons in a widely used correlation between the Maya long count and the Gregorian calendar, landing on December 21st, 2012. To modern ears, especially those already trained by millennial expectation and apocalyptic entertainment, the number carried the mood of a threshold. 13 itself seemed symbolic, ominous, myth-friendly. The completion of a great cycle sounded dramatic enough to invite dread, but within Maya inscriptions the matter appears more restrained and far more interesting. The turning of a cycle could indeed be significant, richly resonant, even charged with cosmological meaning. Yet significance is not the same thing as obliteration. One of the most cited inscriptions in this story comes from Tortuguero Monument 6, a damaged text from the site of Tortuguero in present-day Tabasco, Mexico. It is one of the rare known inscriptions that refers to the completion of the 13th back-toon. Because the text is broken, its full meaning remains uncertain, and uncertainty is fertile soil for imagination. Some readings suggest it mentions the descent or display of the deity Bolon Yocte in connection with that future period ending. This was enough for sensational interpretations to flourish. A damaged monument, a poorly understood deity associated in some contexts with transition, conflict, or underworld aspects, and a distant calendar completion. Together they form the outline of a prophecy that many wish to hear. But wishes are not decipherments. Epigraphers, working with the slow discipline that broken texts demand, have generally resisted apocalyptic readings. The inscription does not clearly announce the destruction of the world. It appears to mark a calendrical completion and a ceremonial or mythic association, not universal annihilation. Its very fragmentary nature should have inspired caution. Instead, caution was often drowned beneath the commercial and emotional appeal of catastrophe. A damaged line became a global countdown. It is difficult to think of a more revealing example of how modern culture handles ambiguity. It does not endure it for long, it monetizes it, dramatizes it, and calls the result revelation. There are other inscriptions that complicate the claim even further. At sites such as Palang, text project dates far beyond 2012, sometimes into spans of time so distant that they almost dissolve the modern obsession into absurdity. The Temple of the Inscriptions and related texts associated with Kinicha Janab Pakal and his dynasty contain forward-looking chronological references that extend well past the completion of 13 back-toons. If the Maya were calmly discussing dates thousands of years beyond 2012, then the idea that they expected all existence to cease at that threshold becomes difficult to defend. A civilization does not typically record future commemorations beyond an absolute ending, unless its concept of time remains open beyond that point. This matters more than it first appears, because the myth of 2012 was not sustained by evidence alone. It was sustained by a modern appetite for terminal meaning. The long count was interpreted as though it functioned like a fuse, but it may be closer in spirit to an odometer or a ritual register of recurrence. When one great unit completes, another begins. The turning itself may hold symbolic force, perhaps even danger in a ceremonial sense, but danger within sacred time is not automatically equivalent to planetary destruction. Ritual transitions often carry tension precisely because they mark renewal, not extinction. The threshold matters because life continues through it, not because everything stops. And yet one can understand why the misunderstanding felt persuasive. The long count does not flatter the ordinary human sense of duration. It dwarfs it. A back-toon is already beyond intuitive grasp for most people. 13 back-toons form a horizon large enough to feel absolute. The completion of such a span seems to demand narrative weight. Modern culture, deprived of ritual literacy but saturated with disaster imagery, supplied the missing narrative almost automatically. A grand count ended, therefore a grand ending must follow. The logic is weak, but emotionally it feels complete. Perhaps this is the more haunting truth beneath the whole episode. The Maya were not wrong about time. Modernity may simply have forgotten how to encounter time ceremonially, without collapsing into spectacle. A cycle closes, and instead of asking what form of renewal or repositioning that closure implies, the modern mind asks how the sky will burn. It is a revealing instinct. It suggests a civilization that has grown unable to imagine transition without collapse. The old calendar then becomes less a source than a screen onto which contemporary anxiety projects itself. There is also an irony, almost cruel in its symmetry, that the long count was treated as a prophecy of the end by cultures whose own historical systems often teach linear creation, linear redemption, and linear apocalypse. The Maya, whose thought moved with recurrence, were rewritten into prophets for traditions that needed an ending more than they did. Their calendar was translated not just across language, but across metaphysical assumptions. In that translation, much was lost. Still, the long count cannot be understood fully without the sky that held it. Numbers alone are never the whole story. Behind the inscriptions lay generations of observation, alignments, planetary tracking, and architectural conversations with horizon and light. To follow the real path beneath the 2012 myth, one must leave the carved dates for a moment and look upward, where Venus burns before dawn, where eclipses disturb the order of day, and where ancient watchers learn to read recurrence in the motion of things that seemed, to less patient eyes, to wander without pattern. There, perhaps, the difference between omen and observation begins to sharpen. If the long count gave the Maya a way to place human events within immense spans of measured time, the sky gave them something even more elusive, recurrence without stillness. Nothing above them remained truly fixed in the way an inattentive glance might suppose. The sun returned, but not as an isolated fact. Venus appeared and vanished with a rhythm that could be counted, though never carelessly. Eclipses disrupted certainty. Solstices shifted light through architecture with a precision that was felt before it was explained. The heavens were not a decorative ceiling. They were movement, interval, warning, return. To live beneath such a sky with disciplined attention was to understand that order itself could wear the face of change. Perhaps that is why the Maya still seem, even now, to belong partly to the stars in the modern imagination. Yet this impression is often romanticized too quickly. They were not dreamers staring upward for symbolic comfort alone. Their astronomical knowledge emerged through generations of repeated observation, codification, correction, and ritual integration. It belonged not to fantasy, but to a world view in which celestial patterns and earthly power were intimately linked. The sky was not merely watched, it was interpreted as part of the larger grammar of existence. This is one reason the modern distortion of 2012 became so persuasive. Once a civilization is known to have studied the heavens carefully, people begin to assume it must also have hidden cosmic warnings in every major date it preserved. But study is not prophecy. The Dresden Codex remains one of the clearest surviving testaments to Maya astronomical sophistication. Within its fragile painted pages are tables devoted to the cycles of Venus, a celestial body whose importance in Maya thought appears to have been immense. The interval of Venus as morning star and evening star was tracked with striking precision, and scholars have long noted how close Maya calculations came to the actual synodic cycle. This was not casual stargazing. It was careful, cumulative, exacting work. Yet Venus was not reduced to a neutral object of calculation. It bore ritual force. Its appearances could be linked to war, timing, and omen. Here again the modern habit of separating science from sacred meaning begins to fail. For the Maya, the heavens could be mathematically structured and symbolically charged at the same time. This duality matters. It shows why later readers, especially those hungry for hidden signs, found Maya materials so easy to misuse. A culture that combines numerical sophistication with cosmic symbolism becomes irresistible to apocalyptic imagination. Every astronomical notation begins to look like a code. Every calendrical completion begins to suggest a celestial trigger. But a symbolic cosmos does not automatically become a catastrophic one. Meaning does not equal doom. There is something quietly humbling in the way Maya architecture engages with light. At sites such as Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and others across the Maya world, buildings appear to converse with horizon events in ways that are still studied and debated. Certain alignments may frame solstitial sunrises or sunsets. Certain structures may emphasize specific celestial events or ritual timings. The famous serpent shadow effect at El Castillo during the equinoxes has become almost too famous, absorbed into tourist expectation, yet even stripped of spectacle it gestures towards something profound. Architecture used not simply to occupy land, but to collaborate with the recurring behaviour of the sky. Stone becomes a form of listening, and listening perhaps is the right word. The Maya were not alone in building with the heavens in mind. Many ancient cultures did. But in the Maya case, the fusion of writing, mathematics, kingship, ritual practice, and celestial observation produced an environment in which time could be embodied across multiple forms at once. A ruler's accession might be commemorated on a stela with a long count date. That date might resonate within larger cyclical structures. The event might unfold in a built space aligned to solar or planetary phenomena. The sky, the inscription, the ceremony, and the political body all participated in the same choreography. To isolate a single date from that whole and treat it like a free-floating prediction of apocalypse is not merely a simplification. It is a removal from context so severe that the original meaning begins to invert. Eclipses offer another revealing example. The Maya tracked eclipse possibilities with enough care that later scholars could recognize systematic attempts to anticipate these disturbances. An eclipse is an interruption, a temporary disorder in the visible order of the sky. It invites fear almost automatically, even in highly technical societies. But fear and observation can coexist. To chart eclipse cycles is not to worship panic. It is to discipline it. This may be one of the forgotten lessons buried beneath the myth of 2012. Ancient peoples were not always more superstitious than the modern world. Sometimes they simply ritualized uncertainty rather than denying it. They built intellectual and ceremonial forms capable of holding disruption without collapsing into total eschatology. Modern culture often does the opposite. It receives uncertainty, amplifies it through media systems, strips it of context, and redistributes it as absolute crisis. By the early 21st century, that pattern was everywhere. Planetary alignments were invoked as if symbolic geometries in the sky must naturally produce destruction on Earth. Solar activity was pulled into speculative chains of meaning. Magnetic reversal theories, misunderstood astronomical claims, and half-digested snippets of ancient wisdom circulated together in documentaries, paperback prophecies, web forums, and breathless countdowns. The Maya, because they were already associated with celestial knowledge, became a perfect anchor for this atmosphere of anxious synthesis. Their authority was borrowed to stabilize ideas they had never actually expressed. Yet the more carefully one looks at Maya astronomy, the less it resembles an obsession with terminal endings, and the more it resembles sustained coexistence with patterned instability. Celestial cycles do not erase change. They reveal that change itself has structure. Venus disappears and returns. The sun reaches its turning points. The moon stages its interruptions. Light moves across temples differently at different moments of the year. Time does not flatten into sameness, but neither does it rush blindly toward a final wall. It breathes in intervals as symmetries and returns. There is something almost medicinal in that perception, though perhaps also something unsettling. A civilization that watches recurrence long enough begins to suspect that crisis too may be cyclical. This is not comforting in any shallow sense. Droughts recur, wars recur, dynasties rise and fail. Sacred order must be renewed because it frays. The heavens themselves model continuity through variation. In such a cosmos, one does not expect safety to be permanent, but neither does one assume that a great threshold must mean total extinction. One learns instead to read transition with seriousness. This is where the modern reception of 2012 becomes especially revealing. It did not inherit Maya astronomy as a discipline of attention. It inherited it as an aesthetic of mystery. The difference is enormous. Attention requires patience, context, and limits. Mystery, when packaged for anxious mass culture, requires only enough truth to nourish imagination. A civilization of astronomer priests becomes a civilization of hidden warnings. A cycle becomes a countdown. Observation becomes prophecy. And somewhere in the middle of that transformation, the sky itself is no longer being studied. It is being used. Still, the deeper one moves into the surviving traces of Maya thought, the harder it becomes to sustain the fantasy that 2012 was ever meant to be a final message of doom. The real tragedy lies elsewhere. Much of what the Maya knew reached the modern world only through fracture. A few codices, weathered inscriptions, colonial descriptions, broken monuments, and the long incomplete labour of decipherment. If the sky was once part of a coherent intellectual world, then that world did not arrive intact. It arrived scattered, and scattered knowledge, especially knowledge torn by conquest, invites another danger beyond misunderstanding. It invites those who inherit fragments to believe they have discovered secrets where they have actually inherited wounds. A wound in history rarely appears as a clean absence. More often it survives as distortion, as ash mixed with memory, as a surviving fragment forced to speak for a vanished whole. This is the atmosphere surrounding nearly everything the modern world thinks it knows about the Maya. The stones remain, yes. Some inscriptions endure. A small number of codices escape destruction almost by miracle. Colonial witnesses left descriptions, some careful, some arrogant, some poisoned by their own certainty. And from all this, scholars, seekers, mystics, and opportunists have tried to reconstruct an intellectual universe that was never handed down intact. One begins to understand why misunderstanding became so powerful. The archive did not arrive in pieces by accident. It was broken. Few images in the history of the Americas are as quietly devastating as that of Maya books being burned. In the 16th century, Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar later known for both destroying indigenous materials and documenting aspects of Maya life, described the elimination of books and ritual objects he considered full of falsehood and superstition. The act has echoed forward like a cultural amputation. Bark paper codices, folded and painted with astronomy, ritual reckoning, dynastic knowledge, and sacred timing, were reduced to smoke under the authority of a religion convinced it was cleansing error. One does not need to romanticize everything those books contained to feel the scale of the loss. An entire civilization's habits of remembering were forced through fire, and yet, as if history wished to leave behind permanent irony, some of what later generations learned about Maya writing came through the same damaged colonial channel. Landa's attempts to record elements of the script would eventually mislead and assist decipherment in different ways. Here the pattern becomes almost unbearable. Destruction and preservation were not cleanly separated. The hand that erased also, unintentionally, helped transmit fragments. This is one reason the Maya past feels so haunted. It reaches the present through contradiction. Voices survive, but filtered through those who often wish they would not. Only 4 pre-Columbian codices are widely accepted today. The Dresden Codex, perhaps the most celebrated, preserves astronomical and ritual tables of astonishing sophistication. The Madrid Codex carries material tied to divination and ceremony. The Paris Codex, fragmentary and damaged, still hints at cycles of order that once stood more fully revealed. The Grolier Codex, long disputed and now more often recognized as authentic, widened the narrow doorway of survival just slightly. 4 books. From a civilization that wrote across centuries, across cities, across dynasties, across intellectual traditions still only partly recovered. 4 books standing in for a lost library of worlds. What happens to meaning when almost everything is gone? It becomes fragile, then desirable, then dangerous. A damaged archive creates 2 equal and opposite temptations. One is reduction. The surviving material is made smaller, flatter, and easier to fit into the categories of those who inherit it. The other is inflation. The gaps become so seductive that every fragment begins to glow with secret significance. The Maya have suffered from both. They have been reduced into textbook icons of astronomy, architecture, and collapse, and inflated into prophets of cosmic revelation, guardians of hidden frequencies, or custodians of world-ending dates. In each case, something essential is lost. A living civilization becomes either a diagram or a projection. This is why the story of 2012 cannot be separated from the story of colonial destruction. The prophecy did not arise from a complete body of Maya teaching calmly transmitted across time. It emerged from a field of fragments, interpreted by outsiders across centuries, under conditions shaped by conquest. Knowledge torn from its ceremonial setting does not remain neutral. It becomes vulnerable to translation by the loudest culture that inherits it. If that culture is already burdened with apocalyptic habits, then even a calendrical transition may be dressed in the language of final judgment. There is another layer still, less dramatic but perhaps more profound. When books are burned, it is not only information that vanishes, methods vanish, context vanishes. The tone with which a text would have been read vanishes. The relationships between one manuscript and another vanish. The difference between literal and ceremonial language becomes harder to recover. Humour, caution, local references, ritual instructions, assumptions too obvious to explain, all of these disappear with the ecology of writing that once sustained them. Later readers then stare at isolated inscriptions and ask them to carry burdens they were never meant to carry alone. A single damaged monument mentioning a future period ending can be turned into a prophecy of doom only in a world that has forgotten how much surrounding interpretation has been lost. And perhaps this is where the larger philosophical unease begins to deepen. Because the destruction of Maya texts was not merely a historical tragedy confined to one region and one people. It belongs to a broader human pattern. Empires repeatedly destroy what they do not understand. Then later generations inherit the silence and mistake it for mystery. Libraries burn, priesthoods are broken, scripts fall out of use, oral traditions are shamed or suppressed. Then centuries pass, and the descendants of the destroyers grow fascinated by the enigmas they themselves helped produce. Mystery, in that sense, is sometimes just the afterimage of violence. The Maya script itself reflects this long struggle between survival and disappearance. For generations, it was misunderstood by outsiders who assumed it was largely symbolic or purely calendrical, incapable of carrying the richness of historical narrative. That assumption said as much about colonial prejudice as it did about the script. Only in the 20th century did major breakthroughs in decipherment begin to reveal the inscriptions as records of dynasties, wars, accessions, ritual acts, political claims, and historical memory. The stones had been speaking in fuller sentences than many were prepared to believe. Once again, the Maya were not becoming more sophisticated under modern eyes. Modern eyes were slowly catching up. This matters because the myth of 2012 depended in part on keeping Maya writing suspended between decipherment and fantasy. Enough had been learned to make the civilization seem authoritative. Enough remained obscure to make it seem limitless. That is a perfect condition for projection. The public could hear that the Maya were great astronomers, expert timekeepers, and keepers of advanced calendrical knowledge. Then, into the remaining uncertainty, almost anything could be poured. Galactic alignments, planetary cleansing, hidden warnings, sacred resets. The less complete the archive, the easier it became for modern unease to masquerade as recovered ancient wisdom. Yet the surviving materials point in a different direction. They reveal complexity, specificity, regional diversity, political life, ceremony, calculation, continuity, rupture, and adaptation. They do not present a civilization obsessed with one final terminal date. They present a civilization deeply engaged with pattern and transition, attentive to sacred order yet fully entangled in earthly struggle. In a strange way, this reality is more moving than the myth. It is less cinematic, perhaps, less useful for apocalypse merchants, but far more human. The Maya did not stand outside history, staring serenely toward one final cosmic appointment. They lived inside history, and history struck them with drought, war, ambition, devotion, artistry, and conquest. What remains now is not enough to restore everything. Some silences will never be filled. Some lost codices will never return from the fire. Some ceremonial meanings are gone beyond recovery, and because they are gone, later ages will keep circling the fragments, listening too hard, hearing too much, or hearing the wrong thing entirely. But a fragment can still teach one lesson with unusual clarity. When a civilization reaches the present through ashes, the question is never only what it once knew, it is also who benefited when so much of that knowledge was made easier to misread. By the time the year 2012 approached, it no longer belonged to the Maya. Not in the way the modern world was using it. The date had been lifted out of inscriptions, detached from its ceremonial and intellectual setting, polished by publishers, amplified by television, spiritualized by seekers, dramatized by survivalists, and fed into the circuitry of a global culture already addicted to countdowns. It became less a point in a calendrical system than a vessel into which millions poured their private unease. Financial dread entered it. Ecological dread entered it. Technological dread entered it. Religious expectation entered it. The date itself stood still, but around it gathered a storm of modern meanings that said far more about the early 21st century than about the ancient Maya. This transformation did not happen all at once. Like most successful myths, it advanced through half-credibility. There were real inscriptions. There were real scholarly debates about calendrical correlations and period endings. There were real fragments of ancient cosmology, real astronomical sophistication, real gaps in the archive large enough to invite interpretive excess. Into that unstable mixture came writers, lecturers, documentary producers, alternative theorists, and spiritual entrepreneurs, each selecting a different piece of the puzzle and arranging it into something more emotionally satisfying than caution. A damaged monument was never enough by itself. It needed atmosphere, it needed music, it needed phrases like hidden knowledge, ancient warning, galactic alignment, forgotten prophecy, shift of consciousness, planetary purification. It needed to sound as though history had been whispering toward this exact threshold all along. There is a peculiar authority that modern audiences grant to the ancient past, when the past appears mysterious enough. The older the source, the more it seems to float above ordinary skepticism. A forecast from the present can be doubted because it comes from institutions, experts, algorithms, visible systems of power. A warning attributed to an ancient civilization arrives draped in distance. It seems untouched by modern corruption, and therefore somehow purer. This is one of the quiet engines beneath apocalyptic fascination. The Maya were trusted most when they were least understood. Their authority increased in direct proportion to their removal from ordinary human familiarity. And then there was the calendar itself, which lent visual power to the obsession. Circular stones, glyph blocks, monumental dates, mysterious sequences of numbers, these things photograph beautifully. They carry the seductive appearance of encoded wisdom. One does not have to understand them to feel that they signify something large. In the age of mass media, that feeling was enough. Articles appeared, specials aired, book covers darkened the sky behind stepped pyramids. Web forums braided Maya dates together with solar flares, geomagnetic reversals, rogue planets, and speculative physics. Some treated 2012 as catastrophe, others as spiritual awakening, others as civilizational reset. The details changed, but the emotional structure remained the same. Humanity was nearing a hinge. The old world had somehow known. It is worth pausing over how modern that appetite really was. For all its ancient decoration, the 2012 phenomenon was born in the emotional climate of late modernity. It emerged in a century shaped by nuclear fear, millennium panic, climate instability, widening distrust of institutions, digital overload, economic fragility, and a diffuse sense that ordinary systems of meaning were fraying. Apocalyptic expectation was already in the air long before the Maya date entered popular consciousness. The calendar did not create the tension. It gave the tension a symbolic anchor. It offered form to a fear already searching for form. Perhaps that is why the story spread so easily across groups that otherwise agreed on almost nothing. Secular anxiety could attach itself to environmental collapse scenarios. Spiritual movements could reinterpret the date as an ascent in consciousness. Conspiracy communities could graft it onto secret knowledge and suppressed history. Entertainment media could package it as spectacle. Even those who claimed not to believe in it often felt drawn to watch, read, or listen. A date associated with the end of a great cycle has a gravitational pull even on skepticism. The imagination likes thresholds. It likes to stand near them and ask whether the next room will still resemble the world it knows. And yet all the while, scholars working closest to the actual materials kept repeating versions of the same restrained point. The Maya did not clearly predict the end of the world in 2012. The long count marked a period ending. Period endings mattered. They could be ceremonially significant. They were not therefore apocalyptic in the modern sense. But caution speaks softly, and the market prefers thunder. It is not difficult to see which voice travelled farther. A sentence saying the evidence is fragmentary and the interpretation uncertain has very little chance against a dramatic trailer implying that an ancient civilization foresaw planetary transformation. Ambiguity is truthful, but certainty sells. There is something sad in that imbalance, though not surprising. Modern culture often consumes the past the way it consumes everything else, by compressing complexity into emotionally usable symbols. A civilization becomes a brand of mystery. A calendrical notation becomes a climax. A damaged text becomes a revelation. The Maya, like so many others before them, were turned into a screen for desires they did not author. Some desired cleansing. Some desired vindication. Some desired collapse simply because collapse seemed more meaningful than drift. A long countdown to a final date offered what ordinary life often withheld: shape, destination, narrative closure. This may be the most intimate reason the myth endured. It was not only about fear, it was also about relief. To believe that 2012 marked an end or transformation was, for many, to believe that the confusion of the present might finally gather into significance. History would stop scattering into unrelated crises. Economics, weather, war, technology, spiritual hunger, cultural exhaustion. Everything would resolve into one threshold. The date promised pattern. Even doom can be comforting when compared to the humiliation of chaos. But the Maya did not need chaos to be resolved into one spectacular event. Their system already recognized that life moved through nested cycles, transitions, renewals, and strains. Modernity, less patient with recurrence and less practiced in ceremonial reading, converted that subtlety into a single dramatic horizon. In doing so, it revealed something almost involuntary about itself. It could not imagine a great calendrical completion without narrating it as either destruction or salvation. The middle register, solemn transition without finality, felt too quiet, too difficult, too undramatic for a world trained by spectacle. The closer 2012 came, the stranger the atmosphere became. Public jokes mingled with sincere dread. Survival guides stood beside spiritual seminars. Major films turned planetary destruction into visual entertainment. News coverage toggled between mockery and fascination. The date functioned like a mirror ball turning slowly above a dark room, throwing the same anxious light across very different faces. Some prepared for disaster, some prepared for enlightenment, some dismissed the entire thing while secretly wondering why the question felt so persistent. After all, if almost no credible scholar was endorsing a literal apocalypse, why did the myth still breathe? Because myths do not survive by being true, they survive by making emotional sense. And in that emotional sense, 2012 was never really about what the Maya said. It was about what the modern world longed to hear from a civilization it had already shrouded in ruin, distance, and stolen authority. The Maya became useful precisely because so much of their voice had been interrupted. Their fragments could be arranged into warning, initiation, judgment, or cosmic transition, according to the needs of the present. This was not reverence. It was appropriation disguised as awe. Still, beneath the noise, another question had begun to surface. Quieter, harder, more enduring than the countdown itself. If the modern world was so willing to turn an ancient calendrical transition into an apocalypse, then perhaps the real issue was not a single date. Perhaps the deeper issue was the long habit of translating indigenous knowledge through colonial filters, commercial desire and metaphysical hunger, until even silence began to sound like prophecy. And if that is true, then the path forward does not lead first to the stars or to catastrophe. It leads back into the machinery of erasure, where voices are not only lost but rearranged until the living inherit myths that no longer remember who they were taken from. Erasure is rarely satisfied with destruction alone. Destruction removes the original. Erasure goes further. It reorganizes what remains, teaches later generations how to misremember, and then presents that misremembering as the natural shape of history. In the case of the Maya, this process unfolded across centuries with a patience almost as formidable as the civilization it dimmed. Conquest shattered political worlds, missionaries attacked ritual systems, books were burned, languages were pressured, and local knowledge was forced into the grammar of foreign belief. But after the violence came something quieter, and in some ways more durable. The surviving image of the Maya was gradually rearranged into forms that empires, churches, museums, and modern audiences could more easily manage. This is the hidden corridor through which the myth of 2012 truly travelled. To understand why, one must linger for a moment in the uneasy meeting between Maya thought and Spanish Christianity. The collision was not merely military or administrative, it was temporal. Christian colonial power arrived with its own structure of sacred history, a created world, a fallen world, redemption, judgment, an ultimate end. Time in that framework moves with direction, and direction lends itself naturally to apocalypse. The Maya, by contrast, inhabited overlapping cycles, period endings, ritual returns, and vast counted expanses in which transition did not require absolute termination. When one system conquers another, it does not simply suppress rituals and replace rulers. It also begins translating the conquered people's understanding of time into categories more familiar to itself. That translation can be violent even when it sounds scholarly. A calendrical completion that might have held ceremonial gravity within Maya, thought could be reheard through colonial ears as something more akin to prophecy, omen, or eschatological signal. A ritual system rooted in recurrence could be forced into the language of beginnings and ends. Indigenous cosmology might be reduced to superstition, then later romanticized as secret wisdom, but in both cases it is no longer being encountered on its own terms. The form changes, yet the distortion remains. First, the Maya were dismissed because their thought did not fit Christian universality. Later, they were admired because their thought seemed to hint at alternative revelation. But whether despised or adored, they were still being spoken over. There is a cruelty in this pattern that history repeats with alarming ease. People's books are burned because their knowledge is deemed dangerous or false. Centuries later, fragments of that same knowledge are celebrated precisely for their mystery, their spiritual charge, or their supposed prophetic power. The destroyer and the admirer appear different, yet they are bound by a similar refusal. Neither allows the civilization to remain fully ordinary, fully intellectual, fully human in its own right. It must be corrected, subdued, or elevated into symbol. It cannot simply speak. The language of disappearance played an important role in this. Once the Maya were widely imagined as a vanished civilization, they became easier to appropriate. The vanished do not object. The vanished cannot challenge interpretation. Their descendants, meanwhile, can be pushed to the margins of the story, treated as afterlives rather than continuities. This is one reason the popular image of the Maya long remained trapped between two extremes: noble astronomers of the lost world or tragic remnants of a failed one. Both versions flatter the interpreter. Neither fully restores the presence of living peoples whose languages, traditions, and memories complicate the fantasy of neat endings. And perhaps neat endings were what empire preferred. Empires like clean narratives. They like to imagine that what came before them was either primitive, doomed, or waiting to be fulfilled by conquest. They are uncomfortable with the possibility that what they interrupted was already sophisticated in ways they could neither absorb nor replace without loss. The Maya world posed exactly this discomfort. Here was a civilization with writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, political memory, ceremonial depth, and philosophies of time that did not bend obediently toward European assumptions. To reduce that complexity, the colonial record often oscillated between condemnation and exoticism. Neither mode preserved balance. Modern systems of knowledge inherited some of these distortions, even when their intentions were less openly violent. Early archaeology, museum culture, travel writing, and popular history often treated Maya ruins as if they belonged more naturally to the global imagination than to living indigenous descendants. The jungle-covered pyramid became an object of universal wonder, but the social and colonial conditions that had helped produce its modern silence often remained strangely absent from the frame. The ruin was photographed. The people nearby were backgrounded. Mystery increased in direct proportion to historical context being removed. The 2012 phenomenon did not invent this habit. It inherited it. A date extracted from Maya calendrics could not have become a planetary obsession so easily if the Maya had first been encountered by the mass public as contemporary peoples with deep historical continuity. The date worked because it seemed to come from elsewhere, far away, half lost, ancient, purified by ruin, and therefore available for symbolic use. The less present the Maya were allowed to be, the easier it became for their calendar to function as a blank authority. What modernity feared could be written onto it. What modernity longed for could be written onto it as well. This is why the myth feels, beneath its cosmic drama, so profoundly historical. It was not only a mistake about a date, it was the result of a much older process in which indigenous knowledge was repeatedly filtered through institutions that claimed power over interpretation. First, the Church decided which texts were tolerable, then colonial chroniclers decided which customs were worth describing. Later, museums and scholars decided which artifacts best represented the civilization. Later still, media industries decided which fragments were most emotionally marketable. At every stage selection occurred. Selection is never neutral. It determines what survives, what is foregrounded, what becomes mysterious, and what becomes invisible. Even good faith scholarship has had to wrestle with this inheritance. Decipherment restored astonishing amounts of Maya historical voice, but restoration is not the same as repair. A broken archive remains broken even when more of it can be read. The danger, then, is not only ignorance, it is confidence built atop partial recovery. Enough becomes known to make outsiders feel authoritative, while enough remains lost to encourage imaginative overreach. That unstable middle ground proved ideal for the rise of 2012 mythology. Popular culture could borrow the prestige of scholarship while keeping the openness of mystery. It could say, in effect, that the Maya were too advanced to be ignored and too enigmatic to be contradicted. The irony is that the more one studies the real Maya world, the less dramatic this apocalyptic appropriation becomes, and the more moving the actual historical wound appears. What was broken was not a prophecy. It was a chain of transmission. What was lost was not merely some secret about the end of time. It was an entire ecology of interpretation. Who read the calendar? In what setting? With what ritual training? Among what communities? With what inherited assumptions? Once that ecology is damaged, later readers stand at the edge of an immense silence and confuse their own echo for a message. There may be no final remedy for that. Too much has been burned, scattered, or translated through alien frameworks to restore the whole with confidence. But there is a moral difference between listening humbly to fragments and forcing them into modern scripts of doom. The first acknowledges loss, the second exploits it. And perhaps exploitation is always tempted by the same thing, the authority of the half-heard voice. The world did not end in 2012, but a certain modern fantasy suffered a wound that year. It briefly lost the satisfaction of believing that ancient wisdom had validated contemporary dread. Yet the deeper pattern remained untouched. The appetite for apocalypse did not disappear. It merely moved on in search of another archive, another prophecy, another interrupted civilization waiting to be made useful. Which leaves a troubling thought hanging over the ruins and the records alike. If a culture can be silenced, romanticized, mistranslated, and then recruited to speak someone else's fear, how many of the warnings history seems to give are not really warnings from the past at all, but reflections of the powers that kept deciding which parts of the past were allowed to survive? Once a civilization has been turned into a prophecy, nearly everything about it begins to bend toward the same illusion. Its monuments become warnings, its mathematics becomes code, its silence becomes intention. Even its decline is recast as omen, as though the fall of ancient cities were not a human and environmental crisis unfolding in real landscapes, but a symbolic rehearsal for something that would happen to the rest of the world. This is another way the story of 2012 pulled the Maya out of history. It made their collapse serve modern expectation, instead of forcing modern expectation to confront the complexity of collapse itself. The old narrative was simple enough to travel easily. The Maya reached a height of extraordinary knowledge, foresaw a turning point in time, and then somehow disappeared, leaving behind a broken map for a future civilization too distracted to understand the warning. It is elegant, dramatic, and almost entirely shaped by longing. The real history is far less obedient to dramatic symmetry. The so-called Maya collapse was not a single event, not a universal vanishing, and not a neat cautionary tale arranged for modern audiences. It unfolded unevenly, across centuries, across regions, and through layers of political, ecological, and social stress that remain debated even now. That debate is important. It resists myth. Archaeologists and paleoclimatologists have spent decades trying to understand why many classic Maya cities declined during the 9th century, particularly in the southern lowlands. Their answers do not converge into one theatrical revelation. Instead, they gather around a series of overlapping pressures. Evidence from lake sediments, speleothems and caves, and other paleoclimate records suggest that episodes of severe and prolonged drought affected parts of the Maya world at crucial moments. Water, always sacred and practical in a landscape where rainfall patterns could dictate survival, may have become uncertain in ways that strained agriculture, legitimacy, and everyday life all at once. A civilization deeply attentive to time and celestial order still had to face the material fact that maize withers when the rains hesitate too long. But drought alone explains little if pulled away from the human systems already under strain. Populations had grown, landscapes had been intensively managed, forest cover shifted. Soil fatigue may have accumulated in some areas. Rival polities fought for dominance, tribute, captives, and dynastic prestige. Inscriptions attest to warfare. Defensive structures increased in some regions. Alliances broke. Kingship, which relied not only on force but on ritual performance, and the ability to mediate between cosmic order and earthly abundance, may have become increasingly fragile when environmental and political pressures converged. A ruler who could no longer guarantee stability might still commission monuments, but stone cannot irrigate a failed season. This convergence matters because it restores the Maya to a human scale without diminishing their sophistication. They were not a mystical people swallowed by fate after completing some cosmic calculation. They were communities navigating stress inside highly developed political and ceremonial systems. Their brilliance did not exempt them from vulnerability. If anything, complexity can intensify vulnerability. The more tightly legitimacy is bound to successful coordination of crops, tribute, labour, ritual, astronomy, warfare, the more dangerous each strain becomes when it ripples through the whole. And perhaps that is what makes the real story so much more unsettling than the 2012 fantasy. Apocalypse is sudden. It offers a single date, a final spectacle, a decisive break. Collapse in history is slower, more humiliating, and more difficult to narrate. It comes through repeated failures to recover equilibrium. It comes when institutions continue performing certainty after the conditions that once supported certainty have begun to decay. It comes when warning signs are visible but distributed, undeniable yet deniable, each too partial to compel full response. A city does not always know the moment it has crossed into decline. It may continue building even as the ground beneath confidence shifts. The Maya world offers precisely this kind of unease. Some cities were abandoned, others adapted. Some regions transformed rather than simply ending. The northern lowlands later saw flourishing centres such as Chichen Itza and Mayapan. Trade networks reconfigured, ritual life continued, political forms changed. The word collapse, though useful, is itself a kind of simplification, because it compresses varied local histories into one dark abstraction. What modern audiences often crave from ancient collapse is a clean moral lesson, but history seldom grants those. The Maya case does not say civilization ends when one error is made. It suggests instead that stress accumulates through ecology, governance, belief, competition, and adaptation, and that what breaks in one place may persist in another under altered forms. Still, the image of the abandoned city remains powerful. A plaza once crowded with ritual bodies falls quiet. A stela stands after the dynasty that raised it has lost its voice. Reservoirs dry or silt. Painted walls fade. Jungle enters the architecture slowly, then completely. To later eyes, this looks like disappearance. To the imagination hungry for prophecy, it looks like evidence that the Maya knew something unbearable was coming. But ruins do not prove foresight. They prove mortality. They remind every later civilization that intelligence and achievement do not cancel exposure to drought, war, rigidity, or ecological strain. Perhaps this is why modern culture preferred the cleaner story of 2012. The real lesson of Maya decline is too dispersed to mark it easily. It does not flatter the audience with cosmic centrality. It does not grant the thrill of a final countdown. It asks instead for a quieter and more uncomfortable recognition that complex societies can become brittle while still appearing grand, that sacred and political systems can lose traction under material stress, that human communities often continue after urban collapse in ways outsiders fail to notice, and that history rarely announces its turning points with the simplicity later ages demand. There is a particularly haunting irony here. The same culture that transformed a Maya period ending into global apocalypse often ignored the genuinely apocalyptic dimensions of colonial invasion that later struck Maya peoples. Disease, forced conversion, violence, tribute demands, land dispossession, and the destruction of knowledge systems altered the Maya world far more catastrophically than any calendrical transition in 2012 ever did. Yet popular imagination preferred a speculative end of the world to the documented devastation of conquest. The fantasy was grander, the truth was more accusatory, and perhaps that is one of the most persistent habits of historical misreading, to seek dramatic cosmic explanations where earthly power has already left fingerprints everywhere. The Maya collapse, insofar as one may still use that word, was not a single shadow passing over a single map. It was a textured transformation shaped by climate variability, political fracture, warfare, adaptation, resilience, and regional divergence. Some cities fell quiet, some traditions endured, some lineages ended, some communities survived and changed. The story is not one of total disappearance. It is one of uneven continuation through rupture. Yet to the modern imagination, uneven continuation has very little charm. It does not satisfy the appetite for endings. It offers no climax, only consequence. And consequence is harder to mythologize. Still, it is consequence that draws the listener close to the present. Because once the false apocalyptic aura fades, the Maya world begins to reflect something more intimate than a failed prophecy. It reflects the predicament of all civilizations that mistake complexity for permanence. Reservoirs, alliances, hierarchies, food systems, rituals of legitimacy, stories about cosmic order. None of these are illusions, but none are invulnerable. They require renewal. They require flexibility. They require forms of memory that do not disappear when institutions do. The Maya knew how to count great cycles, yet even great cycles could not spare them from the strain of earthly conditions. The question left behind, then, is not whether the world was supposed to end in 2012. It is whether later societies preferred that fantasy, because it was easier than facing a much older, slower truth, that the end of a world rarely arrives as fire from the heavens, and far more often as the moment a civilization can no longer tell the difference between the order it performs and the instability already moving beneath its feet. For a long time, the jungle helped preserve a misunderstanding. It covered the stones, softened the outlines of plazas and causeways, and allowed the modern imagination to indulge a particular fantasy, that the Maya world had been swallowed whole, as if time itself had closed over it like water over a submerged city. There is a strange romance in that image. It makes loss feel elegant. It makes historical interruption look almost natural. But forests do not erase civilization so much as fold them into another kind of waiting. Beneath roots and leaf litter, under layers of sediment and humidity, the Maya world remained less vanished than unread. And as the means of reading improved, the old story began to tremble. Archaeology has always moved with a peculiar rhythm. It uncovers slowly, then suddenly. A broken inscription is studied for years, and then one phonetic breakthrough changes an entire dynasty. A hill assumed to be natural reveals a platform beneath it. A path in the jungle becomes a sakbe, a raised causeway once linking ceremonial and political space across surprising distances. Yet in recent years, especially with the use of LIDAR, the scale of that unread world has become newly difficult to ignore. Aircraft sending laser pulses through forest canopies have revealed terraces, walls, reservoirs, fortifications, roadways, and urban sprawl hidden beneath vegetation across parts of the Maya lowlands. Features once invisible from the ground emerged as patterns. The jungle had not consumed emptiness. it had concealed density. This matters for more than archaeology alone. It changes the emotional architecture of the story. A civilization imagined as mysteriously vanished invites prophecy. A civilization revealed as vast, infrastructural, regionally interconnected, and materially sophisticated demands something else: historical seriousness. The more the hidden Maya landscape comes into view, the harder it becomes to sustain the fantasy of a people who left behind little more than symbolic monuments and enigmatic dates. What emerges instead is a world of labour, management, engineering, adaptation, and enormous human coordination. Reservoir systems suggest careful responses to seasonal uncertainty. Terracing and landscape modification reveal agricultural ambition. Defensive works in some regions hint at prolonged insecurity. Causeways suggest political and ceremonial integration across wider geographies than older maps had allowed. The hidden city is not only beautiful, it is administratively complex. And perhaps that is one reason the discoveries feel so unsettling. They return the Maya to the realm of full civilization, where mystery does not disappear but becomes less ornamental and more demanding. One can no longer reduce them to star watchers in ruined temples, awaiting a final cosmic deadline. They must be seen as planners, negotiators, builders, dynasts, ritual specialists, scribes, farmers, traders, engineers, and communities capable of reshaping difficult environments over long durations. Their history becomes larger and, in a quiet way, sadder. For the more extensive the world that existed, the more profound the fractures that later passed through it: drought, war, reorganization, conquest, and the slow violence of misremembering. There is also a deeper irony here. The same technological modernity that helped turn 2012 into a global media obsession has also helped dismantle the crude mythology surrounding it. Satellites, remote sensing, digital epigraphy, climate proxies, and new field methods have made the Maya world more legible than it was even a generation ago. Yet what has become legible does not support the old apocalyptic fantasy. It supports nuance. It supports scale without simplification. It supports the idea that the Maya did not merely mark time with eerie brilliance, but inhabited dense political landscapes that changed dramatically over centuries. Technology, in this case, did not confirm prophecy. It corrected projection. Still, correction is never as glamorous as the myth it displaces. When LIDAR maps began revealing the breadth of hidden Maya settlement, what appeared was not a single revelation, but an altered sense of proportion. Tens of thousands of structures across vast regions. Urban networks blended into managed landscapes. Population estimates reconsidered. Systems of water control and movement far more elaborate than the older romantic image of isolated ceremonial centres in the jungle had suggested. It is one thing to marvel at a pyramid. It is another to realize that the pyramid stood within a living fabric of roads, households, fields, boundaries, and engineered survival. Grandeur becomes contextual, and context is often the beginning of humility. This humility is especially important because the myth of 2012 thrived on disproportion. It elevated one calendrical threshold above the whole complexity of Maya life. It took one visible fragment and let it overshadow everything else. But the buried landscapes now insist on another proportion. They remind the listener that a civilization is never reducible to the one thing the future finds most atmospheric about it. Calendars matter, astronomy matters, inscriptions matter, yet none of these floated free from households, kingships, drought responses, ritual obligations, and the ordinary labour of keeping communities alive. Perhaps that is what makes the newly uncovered world feel almost intimate despite its scale. A terrace cut into a hillside, a hidden reservoir, a residential compound emerging from laser data. These do not shout prophecy. They whisper persistence. They suggest mornings of work, seasons of uncertainty, bureaucracies of tribute, repairs after storms, inherited routes through the forest, and 1,000 unnamed decisions by people whose lives were neither abstract nor symbolic. Against that texture, the modern obsession with 2012 begins to look almost embarrassed by its own theatricality. And yet the old attraction to hidden things remains understandable. There is something undeniably haunting in the idea that the forest held entire geographies in reserve, while later centuries argued over a date. It is as though the Maya world itself had been waiting to answer, not with a single sentence, but with overwhelming abundance. No, it seems to say, not by speaking, but by reappearing in fragments of terrain. No, the story was never that small. No, the calendar was not the whole civilization. No, the silence was never simple. What the jungle concealed was not merely the past. It concealed the inadequacy of the stories told about the past. This inadequacy has consequences beyond Maya studies. It reveals a general weakness in how modern cultures consume ancient civilizations. They prefer singular hooks, Atlantis, apocalypse, aliens, vanished wisdom, forbidden maps, cataclysmic dates. These are easy to circulate, but ancient worlds rarely survive in such simple forms. They survive as systems, messy, layered, regionally varied, adaptive, wounded, and only partly recoverable. The Maya, once flattened into a prophecy, are being restored piece by piece to that more difficult condition. The restoration does not eliminate wonder, it deepens it. Yet deepened wonder asks for patience, and patience is a quality mass panic has never loved. There is another shadow beneath these discoveries as well. The more extensive the hidden infrastructures appear, the more clearly one senses how much knowledge can exist without securing permanence. Reservoirs can be built, roads can be raised, calendars can be counted, kings can anchor themselves to cosmic cycles, yet still the reigns can fail, rival powers can intensify, systems can strain, and later empires can burn books. Nothing uncovered beneath the forest promises immunity from history. In a way, that is the most sober reply the Maya world can offer to apocalyptic fantasy. Not that endings come all at once, but that worlds are always more intricate and therefore more vulnerable than outsiders first suppose. The buried cities continue to emerge. Each survey, each excavation, each deciphered text shifts the balance a little more away from myth and toward reality. But reality here is not flat. It carries its own haunting force. It suggests that what people feared in 2012 was never truly hidden in the calendar at all. The real warning, if one insists on using that word, may have been lying elsewhere, in the evidence that even highly ordered civilizations can become unread to the future, and that once unread, they can be made to say almost anything, which leaves the night with a quieter and far less comfortable possibility. Perhaps the most dangerous thing about a broken past is not that it contains secrets, but that it allows the present to mistake its own hunger for the voice of history. By the time the feared date had passed and the sky remained where it had always been, some people laughed, some felt vaguely embarrassed, and others quietly shifted the meaning of the prophecy so that it could survive the failure of literal catastrophe. But beneath the jokes and the relief, a more interesting question remained suspended in the air. Why had so many people wanted the story to be true in the first place? Not merely entertained it, not merely consumed it as spectacle, but wanted it, in some dim and half-confessed chamber of the mind, to gather the confusion of the age into one undeniable event. The Maya had provided the borrowed architecture, but the emotional force came from elsewhere. It came from the modern psyche itself, which has never fully stopped listening for the end. There is something ancient in this habit, though each era dresses it differently. Human beings have long imagined final reckonings, cosmic purifications, cycles of destruction, divine judgments, ages ending in fire, flood, or silence. The forms vary across traditions, but the desire beneath them is often similar. A world that feels morally disordered, politically unstable, spiritually exhausted, or environmentally strained becomes easier to bear if it can be interpreted as nearing a decisive threshold. Suffering gains shape, anxiety gains narrative, randomness is replaced by design. Even doom can feel more merciful than drift. The early 21st century was saturated with precisely the kind of drift that invites apocalyptic thinking. Economic systems appeared vast and fragile at once, capable of collapsing under abstractions no ordinary person could fully see. Climate anxiety grew year by year, but often without the emotional clarity of a single immediate event. Technology accelerated faster than moral language could adjust. Information multiplied, trust thinned, institutions faltered, and private life became increasingly threaded through networks few understood and fewer controlled. The result was not one clean fear, but a diffuse atmosphere of instability, a sense that something fundamental had slipped out of rhythm without yet revealing the form of the break. Into such an atmosphere, a date like 2012 did not enter as an alien idea. It entered as a container. That, perhaps, is the most revealing word. Container. The myth worked because it could hold contradictory needs at once. For some, it held dread of ecological collapse. For others, it held the hope of spiritual awakening. For others still, it held a fantasy of reset, a sweeping interruption that would tear through systems felt to be corrupt beyond repair. There were those who feared solar storms, geomagnetic catastrophe, and civilizational breakdown. There were those who anticipated a new consciousness, a shift in human vibration, an opening long prepared by ancient knowledge. These interpretations often contradicted one another, yet all gathered around the same date because the date itself was less important than the emotional permission it offered. It allowed the present to imagine that it was not merely confused, but transitional. Transitions soothe the mind more than chaos does. This is one reason apocalyptic stories are so durable even when repeatedly disproven. They do not survive because evidence supports them. They survive because they answer psychological needs more elegantly than ordinary history can. Real history is untidy. It advances unevenly. Crises overlap without resolving into one another. Institutions fail slowly. Ecosystems shift across scales too large and too slow for everyday perception. In contrast, apocalypse offers concentration. It brings scattered anxieties into a single beam of significance. The listener no longer has to wonder whether the unease is real. The universe itself confirms it. The Maya, tragically and conveniently, became the confirming voice. Yet it is worth asking why modern people were willing to trust a heavily mediated image of an ancient civilization more readily than the cautious language of contemporary scholarship. Part of the answer lies in distrust. Expert institutions, governments, corporations, and official narratives had already lost a great deal of moral credibility in the public imagination. Ancient authority, by contrast, appeared untouched by these compromised systems. It seemed remote from politics, remote from the marketplace, remote from manipulation, despite the fact that its modern presentation was shaped at every stage by exactly those forces. Distance creates innocence. The further away a voice seems, the less contaminated it feels. This is often an illusion, but it is a powerful one. There is also a more intimate factor. Apocalyptic thinking does not only dramatize fear, it flatters perception. To believe one is living near the end of an age is to feel unusually positioned in history. Ordinary life, with its errands, fatigue, compromises, and repetitions, is suddenly framed by grandeur. A cashier, a student, a software engineer, a lonely insomniac scrolling through midnight forums. Anyone can become a witness to cosmic transition. The self, otherwise small and disposable within bureaucratic modernity, is restored to symbolic significance. This is not vanity in the crude sense. It is a hunger for placement, for a feeling that one's lifetime is not merely another anonymous interval in a system too large to notice it. How strange, then, that this hunger attached itself to a civilization whose own understanding of time often diminished the privilege of any single moment. The modern mind seized on the Maya precisely because it wanted a climax. But the Maya calendar, read more patiently, disperses climax into cycle. It decenters the present. It reminds the reader that large thresholds can occur without granting unique metaphysical importance to the generation experiencing them. In that sense, the real Maya system may have been psychologically intolerable to a culture desperate for exceptionalism. Better then to misread it. One can see this pattern everywhere in popular treatments of 2012. The date was rarely presented as one point in an ancient calendrical framework. It was staged as the point. The sky darkened on posters. Pyramids stood against firelit clouds. Music swelled. Narrators lowered their voices. What was being sold was not just danger but significance. Something immense was about to happen, and the audience, by watching, had already become participants. This is how media systems metabolize anxiety. They turn dread into event and event into identity. But once the date passed, the psychological infrastructure did not vanish. Some believers adjusted the claim. The transformation, they said, had been inward rather than visible. The shift had occurred spiritually, energetically, subtly. Others moved on to new dates, new prophecies, new thresholds. This too is revealing. Apocalyptic expectation is rarely about one calendar alone. It is a habit of mind, a recurring strategy for negotiating uncertainty. When one deadline fails, another can be found. The underlying unease remains available for reattachment, and perhaps that is why the story of 2012 still matters even after its literal failure. It exposed something fragile in the modern relationship to time. Many people no longer trusted gradual change to be meaningful, no longer trusted institutions to narrate reality honestly, and no longer felt that everyday life contained an intelligible place for their anxiety. The result was a craving for large symbolic thresholds. Ancient calendars, prophetic frameworks, and forgotten civilizations became emotional technologies for handling a world that felt simultaneously over-explained and impossible to understand. The Maya did not create that condition. They were used to decorate it. Still, the decoration was not innocent. To transform a wounded archive into a psychological instrument is another form of theft. The past is made to regulate present emotion, while the people to whom that past belongs remain marginal or romanticized. That is why 2012 cannot be dismissed merely as a harmless fad or a strange media episode. It was also a lesson in how easily modern longing can conscript broken histories. A people whose texts were burned and whose voice reached the future through fragments were recruited once again, not to speak their own complexity, but to reassure modern humanity that its dread had cosmic endorsement. And yet the deeper one listens, the more the whole phenomenon begins to sound less like prophecy and more like confession. The Maya calendar did not reveal an ancient certainty that the world would end. It revealed a modern uncertainty so profound that millions were ready to hear an ending where none had been clearly promised. That may be the more haunting truth. Not that the past warned the present, but that the present was already warning itself, using the past as a mask. If so, then the next question becomes harder to avoid. For once the apocalyptic fog begins to clear, other explanations step forward. Solar fears, galactic myths, pole shift scenarios, catastrophic alignments, and speculative systems that attempted to keep the date alive even when its original foundation proved thin. And behind them all waited the same old temptation, to turn uncertainty into cosmic machinery, rather than face how much of the fear had begun much closer to home. Once a date has been charged with enough fear, it begins to attract theories the way a dark horizon attracts weather. They do not arrive in orderly sequence. They gather, overlap, borrow from one another, contradict one another, and yet somehow strengthen the same atmosphere. This is what happened around 2012. Even when the original Maya materials offered no solid basis for a literal apocalypse, the date continued to thicken with alternative explanations. A galactic alignment was said to be approaching. Solar storms were imagined on a civilizational scale. Earth's magnetic poles were invoked, sometimes cautiously, more often wildly. Ancient wisdom, misunderstood astronomy, speculative geology, New Age metaphysics, and popular science drifted together until the whole thing resembled less a single theory than a floating architecture of unease. This architecture is worth examining, not because its claims were equally credible, but because it revealed a remarkable habit of mind. When one explanation weakens, fear does not necessarily recede, it simply changes instruments. The galactic alignment became one of the most elegant examples. The phrase itself sounded immense enough to carry spiritual and catastrophic weight. It suggested that Earth, the Sun, and the centre of the Milky Way were entering a rare and meaningful arrangement, one somehow encoded in Maya understanding and capable of inaugurating transformation on a planetary scale. The image was irresistible. A civilization of skywatchers had looked beyond ordinary astronomy and fixed human destiny to the geometry of the galaxy itself. Yet when examined more carefully, the claim thinned. Astronomers noted that such alignments are not sudden one-day events in the theatrical sense popular culture demanded. Precession operates gradually. Definitions of the alignment varied. The significance attributed to the date was often metaphysical rather than observational, but thin evidence is often enough when the emotional need is thick. Solar storms offered another route. Here at least the fear touched something physically real. The sun does release bursts of energy. Geomagnetic disturbances can affect power grids, satellites, and communications. Space weather is not an invention. Yet 2012 culture often inflated ordinary or plausible scientific concern into near mythic expectation. A solar maximum became not a period of elevated activity within known cycles, but a possible trigger for global collapse or consciousness shift, depending on the narrator's taste. Once again, the Maya were recruited as shadow witnesses, though the actual chain linking their calendrical system to solar disaster was weak or entirely imaginative. Science and symbolism were fused, but not in the disciplined manner of Maya astronomy. They were fused in the looser style of modern anxiety, where technical vocabulary provides emotional legitimacy to fears already looking for cosmic scale. Then there were pole shift scenarios, perhaps the most revealing of all. Earth's magnetic field does change over long durations. Geological records preserve reversals. This is real. But the leap from that real phenomenon to a sudden, date-specific, civilization-ending event tied to 2012 was often enormous. In some tellings, magnetic reversal became crustal displacement, and crustal displacement became near-instant catastrophe. Continents would lurch, oceans would overrun coasts, civilization would reset. The date supplied the deadline, the theory supplied the mechanism, and ancient mystery supplied the aura of prior knowledge. The pattern repeated so consistently that one begins to see its deeper logic. The world did not merely want an ending. It wanted an ending that felt both scientifically plausible and spiritually ancient. That combination is difficult to resist because it flatters two desires at once. It allows the believer to feel both rational and initiated. One is not merely surrendering to myth, one is integrating hidden wisdom with suppressed science. The Maya, in this framework, become less a historical civilization than a validating presence standing just behind the curtain. Their damaged archive is useful precisely because it cannot fully object. A glyph, a monument, a period ending, a general reputation for astronomy. These are enough to stabilize almost any speculative architecture if the audience already longs for synthesis. There is something almost lyrical in the way these theories behaved, though lyricism should not be mistaken for truth. They turned uncertainty into cosmos. They relocated dread from the everyday failures of modern systems to the dramatic machinery of the universe. It is easier, perhaps, to imagine civilization threatened by solar fire than by bureaucracy, inequality, ecological overshoot, brittle infrastructure, and political paralysis. Cosmic danger is terrible, but it is also strangely dignified. It implies that one's crisis belongs to the stars. Social unravelling is less flattering. It suggests that human beings themselves have built worlds too rigid, too extractive, or too fragmented to endure their own consequences. This is why the speculative theories around 2012 cannot be dismissed merely as foolish digressions. They were emotional translations. Each one transformed diffuse historical and ecological fear into a cleaner image. The galaxy aligns, the sun flares, the poles shift, the earth resets. Even spiritualized interpretations followed the same pattern. Consciousness rises, frequencies change, a new age begins. In every version, complexity is gathered into threshold. The world becomes readable again because it is headed somewhere singular. Yet the real Maya world had rarely offered singularity in that form. Its calendrical intelligence was braided, cyclical, layered, and resistant to simple terminal drama. The speculative machinery built around 2012 was, in that sense, deeply un-Maya, even when it claimed Maya inspiration. It took a civilization skilled in reading recurring patterns and converted it into an endorsement of unique climax. Perhaps this is the hidden mark of modernity on every theory it touched. It could not stop narrating toward a grand event. There is another reason these theories spread so effectively. The line between contested research and cultural fantasy is not always clear to the general public. A real astronomical phenomenon may be loosely cited alongside a speculative interpretation. A legitimate geological process may be relocated into a fabricated timetable. A scholarly discussion about symbolism may be merged with a marketable promise of transformation. This blending creates a persuasive fog. Not all the ingredients are false, but their arrangement produces something deeply misleading. That arrangement is often more important than the ingredients themselves. One sees here a broader lesson about broken knowledge. When archives are incomplete and expert communication is uneven, the space between known and unknown becomes intensely vulnerable. Into that space enter not only serious hypotheses, but emotionally useful narratives. Some are harmless in tone, others exploitative, others genuinely destabilizing. But all depend on the same opening. A public that senses the official story is insufficient, and a past that arrives fragmented enough to be conscripted into replacement explanations. The Maya were not the only ones made to bear that burden, but they were especially susceptible because their image already shimmered with astronomy, ruins, lost texts, and temporal vastness. Few civilizations could be recruited so easily into the symbolic workforce of apocalypse, and yet the more carefully one studies the actual historical record, the more the cosmic scaffolding begins to fall away. What remains is not emptiness. It is something quieter, more demanding, and perhaps more difficult to sell. A sophisticated culture of timekeeping, ceremonial transition, and celestial observation was repeatedly overlaid with modern metaphysical hunger, until its subtlety nearly disappeared beneath the noise. Still, noise leaves traces. Even now, years after 2012 passed without global cataclysm, the same emotional structure persists in new forms. Another date appears. Another astronomical event is burdened with civilizational meaning. Another hidden calendar, another prophecy, another coded warning rises from the marketplace of anxiety. The mechanism has not changed. Only the costume does, which raises a more enduring question than whether any one theory was correct. What kind of civilization becomes so vulnerable to threshold myths that it must keep borrowing the cosmos to explain fears it no longer knows how to name in its own language? The most enduring lie ever told about the Maya may not have been that they predicted the end of the world. It may have been something quieter, repeated so often that it began to feel natural, that they were gone. Once a civilization is declared vanished, every fragment it leaves behind becomes easier to possess. Its monuments can be admired without obligation. Its symbols can be borrowed without permission. Its calendar can be translated into whatever the present most desires. Absence, whether real or manufactured, makes appropriation strangely effortless. And so perhaps one of the deepest errors beneath the 2012 myth was not chronological at all. It was the old habit of speaking about the Maya as though they existed only in stone, only in the past tense, only beneath vines and museum glass. But the Maya were never only ruins. They remained in villages, towns, marketplaces, kitchens, fields, and languages. They remained in memory, carried through families and ceremonies, in cosmologies altered yet not extinguished, in ways of naming, planting, observing, and enduring. The descendants of the people who built the great cities did not dissolve when certain dynasties ended or when plazas emptied. They lived through the long aftershocks of political change, drought, conquest, evangelization, forced labour, land loss, state violence, tourism, and modernization. They adapted, resisted, concealed, translated, and continued. This continuation does not erase the historical fractures, it makes them more poignant. For what modernity often calls mystery is sometimes simply the refusal to see survival when it appears in forms less monumental than empire prefers. There is a moral difference between studying an ancient civilization and turning that civilization into a ghost. To ghost the Maya is to treat the past as more authentic than the living descendants who inherit it. It is to imagine that real Maya knowledge ended with codices burned by colonial power, while whatever survives in modern Maya communities is somehow secondary, diluted, or folkloric. Such thinking has haunted anthropology, tourism, spiritual appropriation, and popular media alike. The deeper the fascination with pyramids and prophecy, the easier it becomes to overlook the people speaking Maya languages in the present tense. The world went looking for apocalypse in old inscriptions while often ignoring the fact that the civilization in question had never stopped breathing. This matters profoundly for the story of 2012, because once the Maya are restored as living peoples rather than vanished authorities, the entire emotional structure of the myth begins to weaken. A date no longer floats out of sacred antiquity untouched by history. It belongs to traditions that survive amid colonization, inequality, and contested memory. It is no longer so easy to project world-ending fantasies onto a people who can still answer back, or at least whose continued existence should make such projection feel immediately suspect. And answer back they did, in many ways. Around the approach of 2012, numerous Maya voices, community leaders, scholars, activists, cultural interpreters spoke publicly against the distortion surrounding the date. Some criticized the commercialization of their heritage, some rejected the apocalyptic framing outright. Some tried to redirect attention toward a more grounded understanding of cyclical time, continuity, and renewal. Others pointed out the painful irony of outsiders obsessing over a speculative end-of-the-world date, while indigenous communities continued facing very real crises in the present: poverty, land struggles, environmental pressures, and the enduring shadow of colonial structures. It is difficult to imagine a clearer example of symbolic theft. The global imagination converted Maya time into spectacle, while living Maya peoples were still negotiating the unfinished consequences of history. Yet perhaps symbolic theft is always sustained by aesthetic preference. Ruins are photogenic, living communities are more demanding. Ruins do not interrupt fantasy. Living descendants complicate it with politics, language, survival, and moral claims. A pyramid at sunset can carry mystery without friction. A contemporary Maya speaker discussing land rights, cultural continuity, or the misuse of ancestral knowledge introduces obligations the fantasy would rather avoid. This is why the myth of disappearance remains so useful. It removes the need for relationship. but history resists that convenience. The Maya linguistic family alone testifies to continuity on a scale the popular imagination rarely absorbs. Dozens of Maya languages are still spoken today, each carrying structures of perception, memory, and world relations shaped by long historical depth. Language is not a fossil. It is a living medium of time. Even where ritual systems were pressured, transformed, or syncretized under colonial rule, continuity persisted in subtler forms, in agricultural timing, ceremonial blending, oral memory, sacred geographies, and the durable logic of community practice. To acknowledge this is not to romanticize survival. Survival is often costly, improvised, and marked by compromise, but it is survival nonetheless, and survival changes the ethical terms of interpretation. It asks, who gets to speak for the calendar? Who gets to narrate the meaning of ancient dates? Who profits when those dates are abstracted from living inheritance and turned into global media events? These questions do not yield easy answers, but they expose the structure beneath the old fascination. The 2012 phenomenon treated the Maya as if they were most valuable when stripped of ordinary human continuity. Their authority increased the moment they seemed unreachable. This is a familiar pattern in the modern treatment of indigenous pasts. The dead are venerated, the living are ignored, romanticized, or inconvenienced. Heritage is loved in proportion to how little it interferes with present desires, and yet the continued presence of Maya peoples quietly undoes the illusion. It reminds the listener that time did not stop in the lowlands after the classic period. It did not stop with Spanish invasion either. It did not stop in 2012. The line continues, though bent, though wounded, though interrupted by power. Perhaps that is the truer meaning of endurance, not the preservation of an untouched essence, but the stubborn persistence of people through repeated attempts to erase, rename, or recruit them into someone else's story. There is something almost corrective in this realization. The more one recognizes Maya continuity, the less tempting it becomes to imagine the civilization as a sealed vault of hidden warnings. The calendar returns to context, the ruins return to ancestry, the inscriptions return, however imperfectly, to a broader human world of descendants, memory, and historical claim. Mystery does not vanish, but it loses some of its colonial glamour. The unknown becomes less a playground for projection, and more a field requiring humility. Humility may be the one quality most absent from the story of 2012. The global appetite for apocalypse did not pause to ask whether the civilization being quoted had living inheritors who rejected the quote. It did not slow down to consider whether centuries of destruction had already made interpretation precarious enough. It did not ask whether a people repeatedly spoken for by empire might deserve, at minimum, freedom from being turned into another marketable threshold. Instead, as so often happens, fascination moved faster than responsibility. Still, responsibility has a way of returning even if late. Once the date passed and the spectacle dissolved, the deeper question remained standing among the stones and the living alike. What would it mean to approach the Maya not as vanished prophets, not as decorative astronomers of doom, but as a civilization whose descendants continue to bear both the inheritance and the burden of how the past has been told? That question unsettles more than it comforts, because it pulls interpretation out of fantasy and back into relationship. And relationship is where easy myths begin to fail. For if the Maya were never truly gone, then the entire architecture of 2012 starts to look less like ancient foresight and more like a modern monologue delivered in front of someone else's house, while the people inside were still there all along. The world stood at the gate, listening for prophecy, mistaking silence for permission, but perhaps the silence was never agreement. Perhaps it was only the sound of a long history in which certain voices had learned, through force and exhaustion, what happens when others insist on hearing them only in forms already bent to fit the fears of the age. And if that is true, Then one final threshold begins to emerge, not in the sky, not in the calendar, but in the conscience of the listener. For once the Maya are restored to continuity, the question is no longer whether they predicted the end of the world. It is why so many preferred them dead before they were willing to hear what the living might say. When December 21st, 2012 finally arrived, it did not arrive like prophecy. It arrived like any other day that has been burdened with too much expectation. Morning entered quietly across cities and forests, across apartment windows and mountain ridges, across villages in Mesoamerica and crowded streets far from any Maya homeland. The sky held. Seas did not rise in one theatrical wall, continents did not split, hidden planets did not emerge from darkness. No cosmic machinery revealed itself at the last instant to justify the long fever of anticipation. The world, with almost embarrassing calm, continued, and yet something did end. Not the earth, not history, not time. What ended, at least for a moment, was the illusion that a misunderstood ancient calendar could rescue modern anxiety by giving it a sacred deadline. The date had carried too many projections for too long. It had been asked to validate dread, to sanctify suspicion, to condense diffuse crisis into one final threshold. When nothing visibly apocalyptic occurred, a certain spell thinned. Some dismissed the whole episode as foolishness. Some retreated into irony. Some quietly revised the claim, insisting that the real transformation had been internal, invisible, energetic, too subtle for ordinary perception. But beneath all those reactions lay a quieter and more difficult fact. The world had not failed the prophecy. The prophecy had exposed the world. There is a peculiar silence after collective anticipation collapses. It is not relief exactly, though relief is part of it. It is closer to the hush left behind when a theatre empties and the stage lights cool. One begins to notice the machinery that had produced the drama in the first place. The books, the films, the websites, the speculative lectures, the survival kits, the earnest discussions of alignments and shifts and endings. All of it remained, but now under altered light. Without catastrophe to complete the narrative itself became visible as construction. A calendar date had been dressed in atmosphere until millions mistook mood for evidence. Perhaps this is why the passage of 2012 mattered so much. Failed prophecies are often more revealing than successful predictions could ever be. They show what a culture needed, what it feared, what it romanticized, and what forms of uncertainty it could no longer bear without dramatizing them. The early 21st century had needed a hinge. It had needed one date large enough to gather ecological dread, spiritual exhaustion, technological acceleration, media spectacle, and distrust of institutions into a single symbolic chamber. The Maya happened to provide the fragments around which that chamber could be built. When the date passed, the chamber did not disappear. It simply became transparent. And in that transparency, one could finally see how little the whole obsession had depended on the actual Maya. This may be the most uncomfortable recognition of all. If the world had truly cared first about Maya thought, it would have listened more carefully to epigraphers, to historians, to indigenous voices, to the surviving evidence in all its limits and complications. But the appetite was not for complexity, it was for climax. The calendar was not sought as understanding, but as confirmation. People wanted the past to endorse a feeling the present could not stabilize on its own. That feeling was not always panic in the crude sense. Sometimes it was longing, sometimes exhaustion, sometimes a craving for moral reset, for cosmic interruption, for an event large enough to shatter systems that already felt false. The end of the world is, for some minds, only the most absolute form of wishing that the current world would stop pretending to be whole. This is why many could not entirely let go even after the date had passed. The interpretation shifted shape. Perhaps some said the transformation was spiritual. Perhaps 2012 marked not destruction but awakening. Perhaps the world had changed only inwardly, subtly at the level of consciousness. These reframings are easy to mock, but mockery can miss the deeper pattern. The point was never only literal catastrophe. The point was that a date had to mean something. Empty passage was intolerable. A threshold without visible transformation felt like an insult to the emotional investment that had gathered around it. So meaning was preserved by moving it inward. The apocalypse dissolved into psychology. There is irony here, and perhaps a kind of accidental honesty. For in a sense, something had indeed shifted inward. Not because the Maya had ordained it, but because millions had participated in a modern ritual of projection, and then watched it fail. That failure, however briefly, revealed the structure of their own desire. It showed how easily the present recruits ancient authority when present language has grown too thin to hold its own anxiety. It showed how a damaged archive can become a stage set for contemporary unease. It showed how spectacle can masquerade as historical reverence while barely touching history at all. The day after a failed apocalypse is often more philosophically interesting than the day before it. The day before is swollen with possibility. The day after is forced back into ordinary time. Breakfast still must be made, messages still arrive, traffic still moves, bodies still age. The laundry of existence continues. There is something almost humiliating about this return, because ordinary time strips away the glamour of crisis. It reminds people that no cosmic event is coming to save them from the labour of interpretation, responsibility, adaptation, and change. If the world is unstable, then its instability will likely have to be understood the slow way, infrastructure by infrastructure, season by season, institution by institution, story by story. Perhaps that slowness is what made 2012 so appealing and its passing so anticlimactic. Slowness is hard to dramatize. Slowness rarely goes viral. Slowness asks people to remain awake inside ambiguity. Apocalypse asks only for a date. And yet, if one looks back with enough patience, the anticlimax becomes almost tender. The world continued, yes, but not because ancient wisdom had failed. It continued because the ancient wisdom in question had been misheard from the beginning. The Maya calendar did not collapse. It simply refused the role assigned to it. It remained what it had always been, part of a much larger, subtler, more ceremonial architecture of time than the modern imagination had wanted to permit. In that refusal lies a strange dignity. The stones did not confirm the panic. The inscriptions did not yield the spectacle. The calendar kept its own silence and let modern culture reveal itself instead. What passed on that day, then, was not merely an error. It was a kind of seduction. The seduction of believing that history, the cosmos, and ancient knowledge would converge in one cinematic instant and explain the unease of the age. Afterward, the unease remained. Climate fears did not vanish. Political instability did not vanish. Technological acceleration did not soften. Spiritual fatigue did not resolve. The date passed, but the conditions that had made the date meaningful stayed in place. This is why the story still deserves attention. It was not an isolated delusion. It was a rehearsal in symbolic form for a civilization already struggling to interpret its own turbulence. The Maya, once again, were made to carry more than they had said. Still, there is something instructive in the failure. It leaves behind a cleaner question. If the world did not end in 2012, why did so many need the possibility? Why did a calendrical transition become emotionally irresistible to people far removed from its original cultural home? Why did a modern society, surrounded by data and institutions and explanatory systems, feel compelled to borrow meaning from a broken past rather than trust its own account of the present? These are not questions about gullibility alone. They are questions about spiritual malnutrition, narrative fatigue, and the hunger for thresholds in an age that feels constantly on the verge of something it cannot name. The date has long since passed. The headlines have faded. The countdown clocks were dismantled and forgotten. But a residue remains, like dust after a procession. It lingers in the recurring appetite for new prophetic deadlines, new hidden archives, new astronomical omens, new civilizational resets. The mechanism did not die with 2012. It merely lost one costume, and that may be the quiet warning left behind by the whole episode. Not that the Maya foresaw destruction, but that the modern world, unable to bear its own unfinished crisis, keeps searching for a borrowed ending somewhere else. If so, then the final movement of this story cannot rest on whether the prophecy failed. It must turn instead toward the deeper and more difficult possibility that the real danger was never a date on an ancient calendar, but a civilization so estranged from its own sense of time that it mistook interruption for revelation, spectacle for memory, and its own reflection in the ruins for the voice of the past. In the end, the most haunting thing about 2012 was never the date itself. A date is only a point to which human beings attach meaning, fear, devotion, or error. It has no voice until someone lends it one. And perhaps that is where this long passage finally arrives. Not at a ruined staircase, not at a carved monument, not at the winter threshold that once held the attention of so many restless eyes, but at the quieter recognition that the world was listening for a verdict from the past because it no longer trusted its own language for the present. The Maya did not have to predict the end of the world for the modern world to need them to. Need, after all, has always been one of the most skillful translators. The stones remained patient while others spoke over them. Scholars read, corrected, doubted, revised. Sensationalists dramatized. Publishers packaged. Audiences trembled, scoffed, hoped, and watched. Meanwhile, the actual civilization behind the myth waited in fragments and continuities, in inscriptions half recovered, in codices scorched nearly out of being, in architectural alignments that still catch light the way they once did, in languages that never cease to be spoken, in descendants who carried history not as spectacle, but as burden and inheritance. The farther this story has moved, the clearer its shape has become. The world did not fail to end in 2012 because a prophecy was delayed. It failed to end because the prophecy, as mass culture wanted it, had never truly existed in the form it claimed. And yet one should be careful here. To say that the Maya did not prophesy apocalypse is not to say the modern world's unease was false. Unease was real. It is real still. Ecological strain is real. Political fracture is real. Technological acceleration has indeed altered the tempo of human experience. Institutions do fail. Systems do drift toward brittleness while continuing to perform confidence. Civilizations do inherit fractures they cannot easily name. None of this was imaginary. That may be why the myth of 2012 gained so much force. It attached itself to genuine instability. It merely mislocated the source. Instead of tracing fear through economics, ecology, infrastructure, colonial memory, spiritual exhaustion, and media amplification, it lifted fear into cosmic theatre. It gave the trembling a sky. Perhaps human beings have always done this. When the present becomes too dense, too contradictory, too unresolved, they seek an elevated mirror. Comets, eclipses, calendars, sacred numbers, ancient monuments, distant prophecies. These offer a kind of clean frame around the untidy body of dread. The frame is comforting, even when what it contains is terrifying. It implies order. It suggests that anxiety is not merely personal or political, but woven into the structure of time itself. To be afraid in such a universe is not simply to suffer, it is to participate in revelation. The temptation is easy to understand. But understanding temptation does not absolve the damage it can do. For the Maya were not only misunderstood, they were used. Their wounded archive, already thinned by conquest and centuries of misreading, was asked to authorize a story that belonged largely to the emotional weather of the 21st century. Their complexity was reduced so that modern fear could feel ancient. Their calendar was turned into an instrument for narrating civilizational unease, without having to confront the ordinary human causes of that unease. Even reverence can become a form of violence when it refuses to let the other remain fully real. A civilization admired only as mystery is still being denied its humanity, and perhaps this is the quiet moral core of the whole journey. Misreading the past is never only an intellectual mistake, it can also be an ethical one. When lost or interrupted cultures are made to confirm present desires, those desires begin to look wiser than they are. A fragment becomes an oracle, a silence becomes permission, a ruined city becomes proof of whatever the present already suspects. This is how history is repeatedly recruited into myth, not through outright invention alone, but through the pressure of longing placed upon incomplete evidence. The Maya were not the first to suffer this, and they will not be the last. Broken archives are always vulnerable to people who prefer revelation to restraint. Still, there is a gentler way to stand before what remains. It begins with accepting that some knowledge was destroyed and cannot be restored whole. It continues with recognizing that living descendants are not decorative footnotes to ancient greatness, but part of the civilization's unbroken afterlife. It asks that mystery remain mystery where evidence truly thins, rather than being filled with whatever drama the age happens to crave. It asks for patience with ambiguity, which may be the rarest virtue in any era obsessed with endings. And above all, it asks that time be encountered with more humility than hunger. The Maya knew how to count immense cycles, but perhaps the deeper lesson is not numerical at all. Perhaps it lies in proportion. Human beings are small inside great durations. Civilizations rise, organize memory, bind power to heaven, carve stone, burn bright, fracture, adapt, and are later misread by those who inherit their ruins. To recognize this is not cause for despair. It is a kind of sobering tenderness. It reminds the listener that no age stands outside the risk of distortion, not even the age that believes itself most informed. The future, too, may inherit only fragments of the present. It may mistake our fears for our wisdom. It may study our symbols and hear in them whatever it most needs to hear. The thought is not comforting, but it is clarifying. That is why the story of 2012 lingers, even after the date has long dissolved into ordinary history. It was never merely about a failed apocalypse. It was about a civilization in search of thresholds, about the ease with which modern culture turns uncertainty into spectacle, and about the peril of listening to the past only when it appears to echo one's own panic. The calendar became famous not because it ended time, but because it touched a society already estranged from time's slower meanings. A culture trained to count productivity, acceleration, and crisis stumbled upon an older architecture of cycles and, unable to inhabit its patience, translated it into doom. Outside, night still gathers the world in its own ancient way. Shadows lengthen over stone and asphalt alike. Somewhere rain moves through leaves above buried foundations. Somewhere a language survives another century because a grandmother keeps speaking it. Somewhere a carved date remains on a weathered monument, no more responsible for human fear than the stars are for the stories cast upon them. The world did not end in 2012, but perhaps something was revealed with unusual sharpness. How easily people mistake the edge of their own understanding for the edge of the world. And that in the end may be the warning worth keeping close, not as panic, not as prophecy, but as a quieter discipline of attention. When history arrives in fragments, when the archive is wounded, when the past seems to glow with unfinished meaning, the first task is not to ask what catastrophe it predicts. The first task is to ask what has been lost, who was silenced, what has been projected into the silence, and why the present is so desperate to hear itself spoken from ancient stone. The Maya do not need the world's apocalypse in order to remain profound. Their cities, calendars, mathematics, ceremonies, losses, survivals, and descendants already hold more than enough gravity. The real mystery was never whether they foresaw one final day. The real mystery was why so many were willing to believe that truth must arrive as destruction before they would look carefully at the civilization itself. Perhaps that is the oldest weakness of all. Not fear of the end, but impatience with complexity. Not devotion to history, but hunger for confirmation. So the night closes not with a conclusion, but with an image. A staircase disappearing into jungle shadow. A glyph worn thin by rain. A fire that once consumed books no one can now replace. A child in the present speaking a language older than empires that tried to silence it. And beyond all of it, time continuing, not as a straight blade, not as a single countdown, but as something more difficult, more patient and more alive than panic can endure. If there is a lesson there, it does not shout. It waits. And perhaps the deepest things always do.